This is the third and final part of the Almost Easy Landing Gear Extension Procedure presentation. There'll be one question on the quiz from this portion of the program. All right, let's look at some other considerations for manual landing gear extension. How about using the autopilot? Absolutely. If you have electricity available, if the reason for having to manually extend the landing gear isn't a total electrical failure, then absolutely use your autopilot if it's available and operating. Altitude and heading modes work great. You can also, if you're tracking a navigation signal, you've got a vector that's direct to a VOR or a clearance that direct to a VOR or to a GPS holding point. You can engage the navigation mode of the autopilot also. If you're using the autopilot, use the same procedure that we discussed for manually extending. In other words, hand crank a few turns, and then add about an inch of manifold pressure. When you're hand flying the airplane, you're adding manifold pressure to hold altitude. The gear begins to extend, and the airplane begins to descend because of the drag. If you're using an altitude hold mode on the autopilot, you're adding the power incrementally to maintain airspeed. As the gear goes out, the airplane is going to decelerate, so you're going to have to add power to keep it from getting too slowly. I did a flight test many years ago with the gentleman who was at the time the head of piston training at Flight Safety, my boss, and we found that a King 150 autopilot can potentially cause a Bonanza to stall during the manual landing gear extension procedure if you begin at about 100 knots indicated airspeed and you don't add any power. So use the autopilot if you have it, but use the same technique regardless. Now, what if you have to extend the landing gear on battery power alone? You've had an alternator failure and you're not in an airplane equipped with a backup alternator system. If you have to extend the landing gear on battery power alone, my recommendation is that you extend the landing gear and then back it up by completing the landing gear manual extension procedure. As we discussed, the landing gear may not get quite all of the way into the downlocks if it's extended on something less than full system voltage. And there is a high correlation in Bonanzas between reported electrical failures in flight and a landing gear collapse on touchdown. So if you have to extend on battery power alone, go ahead and use the gear motor if you want for most of the work. But when that's done, reference your procedure, pull the circuit breaker, engage the handle, crank it counterclockwise, coming across the top of rotation comes towards you in the pilot seat until it won't go down any farther. Another very common reason to have to do a manual gear extension procedure is a single bad armature in the landing gear motor. We talked about that earlier. This is the reason that you pull the circuit breaker before you begin hand cranking the landing gear. Now, if you suspect that this is the situation, you can save yourself a lot of work in the gear extension process by doing this. Put the gear handle down. The gear doesn't move, okay? That's why you're having a hand crank. Follow the procedure, pull the breaker. Instead of cranking a great distance, engage the landing gear hand crank. Give it about a turn or two, then stow the handle again and reset the circuit breaker. Now by cranking, when you hand crank the gear, you're also spinning the electric motor around. And if you've spun it around to where it's now on a good brush, when you reset the breaker, the gear motor will take off and the gear will go the rest of the way down. This is why it's very important that you stow the landing gear handle before you reset the breaker. But you can save yourself a lot of trouble if everything appears normal except the landing gear won't go quite all the way down by itself. It's common parlance to arrange for a flyby or an air-to-air inspection of an airplane after you've done a landing gear manual extension. You can do that if you want, but do so very cautiously. There have been a number of fairly high-profile mid-air collisions while pilots have attempted to do a visual inspection of landing gear air-to-air. Unless you and the other pilot are both highly experienced at close formation flying, and you brief over the radio extensively on how you're going to fly this formation before you get too close. Unless you do all of that, I recommend that you do not attempt to get an air-to-air inspection of your airplane. Instead, you might try to do a flyby of a tower control facility. Now, we said before that the last three things that happen in the gear extension procedure happen in this order. The lights come on, the inner gear doors retract fully against the underside of the wing, and then the gear goes into the down locks. Those drooping gear doors, if the gear is not fully extended, even a small droop of the inner gear doors, it's not fully retracted, is going to be fairly visible by a controller using binoculars. So if you do decide to do a flyby of a control tower to verify the gear extension, tell them to do two things. Number one, does the gear appear to be fully down? And two, using their binoculars, see if the inner gear doors are retracted fully against the underside of the wing. I've actually talked to a number of controllers who knew this, so the word is out about beach airplanes to watch for this sort of thing. If the landing gear appears to be down, but the gear doors are not fully closed, that's a good indication that the gear is not all of the way down. You may want to crank a little bit more, and if it won't crank any longer, you want to be certain to be ready for a gear collapse in case something is more mechanically challenging with the landing gear. Once you've done a manual landing gear extension, when you need to land, do so as gently as possible. Use your best soft field landing technique. Try to avoid crosswinds and turbulence if at all possible. You may not have the choice. And let the nose gently come down to the runway when you no longer have elevator authority to hold it up. Taxi very slowly. Avoid braking if at all possible. You may even want to shut down on the runway and have somebody come tow you in. There have been a number of cases where pilots have had to do manual gear extension, landed successfully, and then attempted to turn too quickly onto a taxiway or use too heavy braking when they're trying to come to a stop, and that's been the event that triggers a nose gear collapse. Lastly, if you have done a manual landing gear extension for practice, the manual, the pilot's operating handbook also includes a retraction after a practice manual extension checklist. Follow it. Basically, it's going to tell you to stow the handle, reset the breaker, put the gear handle to the up position, and retract the landing gear electrically. But this short procedure is going to remind you to do the most vital and most easily forgotten item, which is to verify that the landing gear manual hand crank is stowed and it's not going to spin around when you run the electric motor. Lastly, remember that landing gear extension is only a part of your pilot and command responsibility. Conversely, landing gear discipline and landing gear knowledge is an important part of flying the airplane, regardless of the operation. If you have any questions, you can send them to me at mastery.flight.training@cox.net. There's a link to the quiz contained in the same email that was sent to you with the links to the online presentations. Take the short quiz, email your results back to me or your answers back to me at the address indicated, and I will forward those to the board of the Beach Employees Flying Club to signify completion of the class. Thank you very much for listening. I appreciate your comments.